Is mental health determined by emotional health? I'm going to utilize an example that I think will really put things into perspective to help people understand what this really means. If you lack necessary emotional health, emotional maturity, let's say, for instance, healthy boundaries, individuation, differentiation. Healthy boundaries is a great foundational standpoint to come from here. If you lack healthy boundaries, the likelihood that you're going to involve yourself in responsibilities that are not your own is very high. Why? Because if you lack healthy boundaries, you don't really see the difference between self and other. You actually more so see other as part of you and are far more likely to take on their emotional dynamic and their shit. If you do see other as separate from you and you do see the necessary responsibility or the necessary boundaries in place, you're going to see that other people's responsibilities are not your own. People that lack necessary healthy emotional maturity, they over involve themselves in other people's lives and responsibilities that are not their own. What does this do to somebody's emotional health? It puts it through different things that it doesn't need to go through. This is why people that have healthy boundaries are healthier, they are happier, and they understand what is and what isn't their responsibilities. People that lack healthy boundaries involve themselves in drama and gossip and a bunch of things that actually violate boundaries. And this oftentimes leads to a lesser quality of life. It leads to unhappiness. It leads to a life where you are just involving yourself in things that you don't need to, but because you don't have healthy boundaries, that's just the way that you think things are supposed to be. And so you have actually normalized these fucked up dynamics that lead you to deep, severe, profound unhappiness, even depression. The more I reflect on it, the more I grow, the more I look at my own progression, the more I realize, oh wow, as I set healthy boundaries, I actually start to realize that the things that I previously invested myself in were actually not my responsibility. And those times that I did invest in those things that were not my responsibility, I actually experienced a lesser quality of life. I was either unhappy or I experienced some level of depression. Not to get into any of the logistics of the things that I experienced in life because boundaries are important to me. But the thing is, people that lack necessary emotional health also lack mental health. Or I should say, a quality, a standard of mental health that would come with somebody that has healthy boundaries. Again, when you lack healthy boundaries, you are involving yourself in stuff that you don't need to. But the reality is, you're probably involving yourself in it because it is comfortable and familiar to childhood. Maybe the dynamic of childhood was drama and gossip. It was over responsibility. Maybe you were parentified and you were made responsible for a parent's finances, or you were made responsible for their emotions. These are just examples. I'm not talking about anybody specifically here, but that's a real thing that happens. And that, in and of itself, is a lack of healthy boundaries and boundary violations. So, as you grow older, you learn to take on responsibilities that are not yours. Maybe you learn to be financially responsible for another adult when that's fucked up. A healthy adult, whether man or woman, has healthy boundaries, individuation, and differentiation. They understand independence in a healthy way, and they understand interdependence in a healthy way. And a lot of the things that we see in society where people caretake, whether financially or emotionally, other people, men to women, uh, maybe even women to men, it's fucked up and unhealthy. It creates an imbalance. It is an imbalanced dynamic. So the people that lack these healthy boundaries, they are more likely to involve themselves in responsibilities that are not their own. What does that do to mental health? brings it way down. Because when you stress yourself out with things that are not your responsibility because you lack healthy boundaries, you bring your mental health down. So, is it safe to say that mental health is determined by emotional health? And you could call it mental and emotional health. How are you? How are you doing? How have you been doing? How has your life been for the longest time? How do you feel? Are you doing okay? Are you happy? Do you feel happy? Do you feel healthy? No, you don't. Do you recognize that what is your responsibility, and what is not your responsibility? Do you recognize responsibility? Do you understand healthy boundaries, individuation, and differentiation? Do you understand the difference between self and other? Were you raised in a way that taught you to believe that you are overly responsible for other people's shit? If you were, and you still lack healthy boundaries, which it's not good or bad or right or wrong, it's just not healthy. Lacking healthy boundaries is an unhealthy dynamic, and the likelihood that you have unhealthy relationships because you lack healthy boundaries is very high. The likelihood that you take on responsibilities that are not yours to take on because you lack healthy boundaries is very high. The likelihood that with that you are, to at least some extent, unhappy because you're taking on all of these responsibilities and stressing yourself out because you lack healthy boundaries is very high. People that have healthy boundaries have a higher quality of life because they have healthy boundaries. They have a better understanding of the differentiation between self and other. There are boundaries there. This is my stuff, that's your stuff. I take care of my stuff, you take care of your stuff. Whenever I start to bleed out into this area and start to involve myself in responsibilities that are not my own, even if it has been normalized, it's stressful, it's unhealthy, it leads to unhappiness, it leads to a lesser quality of life. The emotionally healthier you are, the better quality of life you have. Another example is the way that you would respond to a situation. If you lack healthy boundaries, the likelihood that you disproportionately respond to situations is very high. If you have healthy boundaries, the likelihood that you respond to situations in a calmed tone and just seeing it for what it is very high. A lack of healthy boundaries, a lack of individuation, a lack of differentiation, these lead to a poorer quality of mental health. If everything that you react to is blown out of proportion because you lack healthy boundaries, and you make things far bigger than they need to be, if you explode over spilling milk or dropping a glass and it shattering on the floor, oops. You lack healthy boundaries and you lack a higher quality of mental health. If you find yourself in a pattern where you are consistently involving yourself in things that are not your responsibility, if you find yourself consistently reacting to things blown out of proportion and you lack healthy boundaries, the likelihood that you have a lesser quality of life because your mental health is plummeting is very high. I'm doing what I can to illustrate how people that have healthy boundaries experience a higher quality of life because they have boundaries. This is where I begin and this is where I end. That's where you begin and where you end. I'm not going to involve myself because it's not my responsibility. And you get to choose. People might shame you, they might guilt you. Oh, come on, you can't just involve yourself in this? What, you don't care about that? You choose for you. You get to determine you. But the more I heal, the more I see everything for what it is, the more I realize, wow, yeah, people that lack healthy boundaries, they lack a higher quality of mental health. And it's quite simple as to why they would. If you lack healthy boundaries and you involve yourself in stuff that you don't need to, that is not your responsibility, that is actually a distraction away from your life and what it is that you actually want to do, and you're stressed out all the time, you're fucking sad all the time, and this is a pattern, you're repeating patterns from childhood, you're actually trying to keep your childhood alive through repetition compulsion, yeah, you're going to have a lesser quality of life. That's the reality of it. Emotional health. And when I say emotional health, I'm referring to boundaries, individuation, differentiation. I could say it in another way. Emotional maturity determines mental health. If you are less emotional, if you are less emotionally mature, you're going to have a lesser quality of mental health because you lack healthy boundaries, individuation, and differentiation, and you likely involve yourself in things that you don't need to, that are not your responsibility, that distract you from what's important to your life, that stress you out, that cause you unhappiness and depression. Who the fuck wants that?